Qualitative research as we know it today was born out of what was then called motivational research, which was a post-Freudian kind of psychological approach to trying to understand what were the core motivations that people might have had towards products and services. And it was only in the late 70s, with the birth of planning, that qualitative research, rather than motivational research, took off. And it was because agencies were in great need of understanding how to develop persuasion and communication strategies that were informed rather than just guesswork. And so they adopted what was then called group discussions as the default method to do so. So during the 80s, there was an explosion in the use of focus groups, sometimes supplemented by depths, but usually it was just focus groups. And I suppose towards the end of the 80s or early, maybe it was in the 90s, I can't remember dates too well, there was a growing voice of disillusionment, particularly amongst ad agency creatives who talked about dominant respondents. They were concerned that the people weren't authentic, that they were kind of pretending to be users of X brand or Y brand, but weren't really. But mostly it was about the fact that they resented Mrs. Jones from Cardiff having the right to pass judgment on their creative intention. So, there was this kind of murmuring of discontent. And that led to, I think, researchers and clients exploring other ways to understand human beings. So they went back to observation, which came from mass observation in, the post-war era. They adopted a kind of adapted ethnography. Semiotics came onto the scene in the mid-80s, discourse analysis, which came from linguistics. And many of the methods that we know of today emerged during the 90s and early 2000s as an answer kind of better than focus groups. And I think at that time too, the use of video became really important. So the idea that you were capturing for the client, the respondent in action, whether they were shopping, whether they were preparing breakfast, or actually even writing their own diaries or filming themselves. And that was one of the themes that kind of really began to gather speed in the 2000s. And I think the mistaken idea was that any one of these methods was guaranteed you the truth, whereas in fact I've always believed really strongly that there isn't one truth, and that if you use several or two or three different methods, the best way to understand what's going on is almost like a tapestry, is to look at the crisscross of different colored threads and try and find out the pattern, rather than thinking that an ethnographic approach, for example, is going to be the absolute truth rather than focus groups. I think there have always been predictions that qualitative research is dead. Through different groups who are either users or practitioners. So it could be marketing people, it could be advertising folk, it's even amongst researchers. And, the same old arguments that I've already mentioned have been trotted out, that focus groups are not representative of what real people do or say, that there's dominant respondents, that it's a whole cheating thing going on. There's so many of the arguments that kind of psychically emerge every 5 years or so. And I think at the moment, probably, the challenges are around the use of digital information and automation, where no longer, as in my day, you interviewing people face to face and in their homes, which we used to do before for viewing rooms. But it's online, and the arguments are, are those real people? Are they saying what they, really do or believe? And also, I suppose the emphasis today is, because of Kahneman and behavioral economics, is this huge concentration or emphasis on behavioral biases and understanding why people appear to say one thing and do something else, which, I'm totally behind. I read Kahneman 10 or 15 years ago. But again, the same problem occurs. It's latching onto one model of thinking at the expense of others, which limits the way you can understand something. Particularly, human beings are human beings. We haven't evolved in 40 or 50 years to become different just because there's a digital world now rather than a real world, so to speak. We're exactly the same people as we always are. We're motivated by things that we care about, not whether the latest wet wipe has greater absorbency than another one, or the latest smoothie flavor has got kale in it rather than spinach. I mean, those things are irrelevant to what people really care about. And that's why I think there's still a huge role for qualitative research now and into the future, because the more that clients and all of us rely on big data and quantitative behavioral data, the less we understand about people's deeper cares and concerns and the context in which we all live, which is cultural influences, social influences, the environmental influences, the circumstances in which we're making decisions or acting. And finally, our personal history. And all of those fall well into the realm of qualitative research rather than any sort of other big data method. So I'm optimistic, really optimistic.